I spent 45 years fixing cars that other mechanics had already given up on. Turns out people are a lot harder to repair. When I was 51 years old, I had a stroke. I spent 3 months learning how to hold a coffee cup again with my right hand. And while I was lying in a hospital bed trying to remember how to make a fist, my only son sold my auto repair shop for scrap. Every lift, every wrench, every memory I'd built since I was 24 years old. Gone. He told everyone in town I'd decided to retire. 18 years later, a 21-year-old engineering student walked into the headquarters of the largest automotive diagnostics company in the country, carrying my last name on her resume. She had no idea what that name used to mean, and by the time she found out, neither did I, not really, because some truths don't come back to you all at once. They come back the way rust does, slow, quiet, and then all at once, you're standing in front of something you don't recognize anymore, wondering how long it's been eating away underneath the paint. I want to tell you about my son. I want to tell you about my granddaughter. And I want to tell you what it costs a man to keep his hands clean when everyone around him is telling him to get dirty. My name is Jack Miller. This is the truest thing I've ever told anyone. I opened Miller Auto Repair on a gravel lot behind a feed store when I was 24 years old. I had $1,100, a toolbox my father gave me the week before he died, and a wife named Linda who believed in me more than I believed in myself, which is usually how the good marriages work. Linda ran the front office. She had this way of talking to people that made them feel like the most important customer we'd ever had. Even when we had 6 cars stacked up outside and a broken tow truck, she used to say, "Jack, we don't fix cars. We fix people's lives. The car's just how we get there." I laughed at her the first time she said it. 20 years later, I had it painted on the wall behind the register because I'd finally figured out she was right. We built something real out there. Not fast, not flashy, real. A man would bring in a transmission that 3 other shops told him was a lost cause, and I'd tell him the truth. Sometimes it was a lost cause, and sometimes it wasn't, and either way, I wasn't going to charge him for parts he didn't need. People remember that. In a small town, honesty travels faster than gossip, which is saying something. By the time I was 40, I had 4 bays, 3 mechanics, and a waiting list that stretched out 2, sometimes 3 weeks. People waited on purpose because they knew that when Jack Miller told you your car was fixed, it stayed fixed. Frank came to work for me when he was 19 and I was 31. Skinny kid, barely knew a socket wrench from a spark plug, but he had good hands and better ears. He listened before he talked, which is rare in this business and rarer everywhere else. 35 years later, Frank still worked for me, called me boss, even after I told him 100 times to just call me Jack. And there was Grace. Grace started answering phones for us when she was 19, trying to save up for community college. I paid her tuition, quietly, never told anyone, not even Linda, knew the full amount for a long time. Grace stayed at the front desk for 30 years. She used to say the shop smelled like motor oil and peppermints because I kept a jar of them by the register for the kids who came in with their parents. That was the world I built. That was the world my son grew up inside of, and somehow it wasn't enough for him. Not even close. Ethan was smart. Smarter than me, if I'm being honest, in the ways that show up on paper. Good grades, got into a business school 2 states over, came home with an MBA and a way of talking that made him sound like he was always closing a deal, even when he was just asking someone to pass the salt. He hated the shop. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. It took me a long time to say it without bitterness, but I can say it now. He hated the smell of it. He hated the grease under my fingernails at Sunday dinner. He hated when his college friends would ask what his dad did for a living, and he'd have to say mechanic, like the word itself cost him something. "Dad," he told me once, standing in the doorway of my office with his arms crossed, wearing a suit that cost more than my truck payment, "you're sitting on a gold mine and you don't even see it. This location, this reputation, you could franchise this, you could sell the brand alone for millions. Instead, you're in here every day with grease up to your elbows like it's still 1980. I like grease up to my elbows," I told him. "Keeps a man honest. Can't fake a repair with your hands this dirty." He'd shake his head at that like I was a stubborn old mule who couldn't see the bigger picture. Vanessa, that's his wife, she was worse, in her own quiet way. She never said it outright, not in front of me, but I heard her once at a family barbecue tell her sister that she just couldn't understand how Ethan grew up in that dirty old place and turned out so refined. I was standing right behind the fence when she said it. I didn't say anything. I just went back to flipping burgers and let it sit in my chest like a stone I'd swallowed whole. They wanted the fast version of success, the kind you can can see from a distance. I want the kind you build one honest transaction at a time until one day you look up and 45 years have gone by and there's a line of trucks outside your shop that goes around the block. I should tell you about Sophie now because she's the reason any of this matters at all. Sophie was Ethan and Vanessa's only daughter. From the time she could walk, she followed me around the shop like a shadow with pigtails. She'd sit on an overturned bucket and hand me tools before I even asked for them because she'd been watching long enough to know what came next. By the time she was 7, she could name every socket size on my top drawer. By 10, she fixed her own bicycle chain without asking anyone for help, and she came running into the shop grinning like she'd split the atom. "Grandpa," she said, holding up her greasy hands. "I did it myself." "Course you did," I told her. "You've got good hands, Soph, just like your grandma." Vanessa hated when I let her get dirty. "She's going to smell like a garage at her cotillion," she'd say, only half joking, but Sophie kept coming back. Something in her loved the puzzle of it, the way a broken thing could be understood piece by piece until it made sense again. I used to tell her that's the whole secret to fixing anything, cars or otherwise. You don't fix what you don't understand. You have to get close enough to really look. I was 51 years old on the morning everything changed. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were oil change days, always had been. Some habit from decades back that never left me. I was under a Buick, reaching for a filter wrench, and the left side of my body just stopped listening to me. That's the only way I know how to describe it. My arm went heavy, like it belonged to somebody else. My mouth wouldn't make the words I was trying to say. Frank found me on the shop floor 15 minutes later, and he says I was trying to tell him something, but nothing was coming out right. I woke up in a hospital bed 2 days later with tubes in my arm and a doctor telling me I'd had a stroke and that I was lucky. Lucky, he said, like that word meant anything to a man who couldn't lift a coffee cup to his own mouth. Linda sat beside that bed every single day. She held my right hand, the good one, and she'd read to me from the newspaper because the doctor said familiar routines help the brain remember itself. I couldn't speak clearly for almost 3 weeks. I couldn't walk without help for 2 months. My whole life I had been a man who used his hands to make broken things whole, and now I couldn't even button my own shirt. Ethan visited. I want to be fair about that. He did visit in those early days. He'd stand at the foot of the bed with his hands in his pockets, looking like he didn't know where to put his eyes. I remember one visit clearly, one of the first times I could get a full sentence out again. "Just keep the lights on," I told him. It took me almost a minute to get the words out clean, my mouth still fighting me on every syllable. Frank knows the schedule. Grace has the books. Just don't let it go dark. Ethan nodded. "Don't worry about the shop, Dad. Just focus on getting better." I believed him. That's the part that still sits heavy in my chest all these years later. I believed him completely, the way you believe your own son when he's standing at your hospital bed telling you not to worry. I spent 3 months in rehabilitation, 3 months of relearning how to grip a pencil, how to walk in a straight line, how to say the word wrench without my tongue tripping over the R. Linda drove 2 hours round trip every single day to sit with me. She never once complained. She'd bring me photographs of the shop from Grace's phone. Tell me Frank said the Henderson's truck was ready. Small, ordinary details that felt, in that place, like lifelines back to my own life. I never once thought to ask her to check on the building itself. Why would I? My son had told me not to worry. The day I came home, I insisted on going straight to the shop before we even went to the house. Linda tried to talk me out of it. She said I should rest first, that there'd be time. But something in me needed to see it, needed to stand in that space and know it was still there, still mine, still breathing the way it always had. We turned onto the gravel lot behind the feed store, and I remember Linda's hand tightening on the wheel before she even said anything. The sign was gone, not damaged. Gone, like it had never existed. The bays stood open and empty. Concrete floors bare and swept clean in a way that felt wrong, felt violent almost, because a working shop is never that clean. Grease stains I'd have called permanent were just gone, scrubbed or painted over. The lifts I'd bought, one at a time over 20 years, saving for each one like a farmer saves for rain, gone. My office window was broken, glass still scattered on the sill. I got out of the car slower than I wanted to, my left leg still not entirely convinced it belonged to me, and I walked into the empty bay where I'd spent half my life, and I just stood there. I didn't scream. I want you to understand that because I think people expect a man to scream in a moment like that, and I didn't have it in me. What I had in me was quiet, a terrible, hollow kind of quiet, like the inside of a bell after it's already rung. I found my toolbox behind the building, dumped on its side in a patch of weeds like garbage waiting for pickup. Half the drawers had been pried open, tools scattered, some missing altogether. I knelt down beside it, Took me a long moment, my body still relearning basic things like kneeling, and I started going through what was left, drawer by drawer, the way you'd check on a person after an accident, making sure the important parts were still there. Linda's wedding ring wasn't in the bottom drawer. I need to explain something about that ring. Linda used to hide it in my toolbox every year on our anniversary, tucked inside an old spark plug box in the bottom drawer as a kind of private joke between us. She said it was the safest place in town because nobody in their right mind goes digging through a mechanic's toolbox looking for jewelry. I'd find it there every year and I'd put it back on her finger myself right there in the shop, grease and all. 30 years of anniversaries, and that ring had been in that drawer more nights than it had been on her hand. It wasn't there. The spark plug box was gone. The drawer was empty. I didn't say a word for the rest of that day. Linda drove me home, and I sat in the passenger seat looking at my own hands, and somewhere in that silence, something in me made a decision I didn't fully understand yet. I want to tell you what I didn't do because it matters as much as what I did do. I didn't call Ethan screaming. I didn't hire a lawyer that week. I didn't tell the whole town what my son had done, even though half of them were asking me why the shop had closed. Even though some of them had their own theories, most of them wrong, a few of them closer to the truth than I wanted to admit out loud. What I did was quieter than any of that, and it took me years to understand why I did it that way, but I think I know now. I think some part of me needed to prove to myself more than to anyone else that everything I'd built hadn't been an accident, that it wasn't the building or the lifts or the sign out front that made Miller Auto Repair what it was. It was something inside me, and if that was true, it could be built again. Not because I wanted revenge, because I needed to know I still existed. People in town assumed I was broken. They assumed the stroke had taken more than my speech and my grip. They assumed it had taken my nerve. Ethan told everyone I decided to retire, that the stroke had convinced me it was time to slow down, and people believed it because it was easier to believe than the alternative. Nobody wants to imagine a son doing what mine did. I let them believe it. For a while, I even let myself half believe it. There were mornings that first year when I'd wake up and reach for my keys out of 45 years of habit, and then remember, and just sit on the edge of the bed for a long time before I could make myself stand up. Linda never let me sink too far into that quiet. She had this way of setting a cup of coffee in front of me and saying nothing at all, just waiting, the way she used to wait for a nervous customer to finally say what was really bothering them about their car. One morning, maybe 8 months after the shop closed, she sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Jack Miller, you have spent your whole life fixing things nobody else believed could be fixed. I have watched you do it 1,000 times. I am not going to sit here and watch you decide you're one of the things that can't be." I didn't have an answer for her that morning, but I heard her. We rented a warehouse space on the edge of town, small, maybe a quarter the size of what I'd had before, with a leaking roof in one corner and rent I could barely afford. Frank found out within a week and showed up on my doorstep before I'd even asked him to. "Boss," he said, standing there with his own toolbox in hand, "wherever you're working, I'm working." I told him I couldn't pay him what I used to. He told me he didn't remember asking. Grace came too, part-time at first because she had a family to support, and I genuinely couldn't guarantee her a paycheck those first few months. She kept the books the way she always had, meticulous, honest, never a dollar out of place. When I finally could pay her properly again, 2 years in, she cried at her desk. And when I asked her why, she said, "Because I never stopped believing you'd figure something out, and I don't like being right about things that matter this much." Here's the part of the story I think surprises people the most. I didn't rebuild a repair shop. Not at first anyway. I'd spent 45 years diagnosing engines by ear, by smell, by the particular way a car shuddered when you turned the key. I knew in my hands and my gut things that younger mechanics were starting to rely on computers for. And somewhere in those long, quiet months in that leaking warehouse, an idea started forming that I couldn't quite let go of. I started sketching out a system. Nothing sophisticated at first, just notes in a spiral notebook, for a diagnostic process that combined what a good mechanic knows instinctively with what a machine could measure precisely. I wasn't trying to invent anything revolutionary. I was trying to solve a problem I'd spent my whole career living inside of. Young mechanics, good ones, who didn't yet have 30 years of instinct in their hands, guessing wrong on repairs and costing honest customers money they didn't have. I brought the idea to a software engineer named Priya, who I met through Sophie's high school robotics club of all places. I'd started volunteering there on Saturday mornings, mostly because it kept my hands busy and my mind sharp, and partly because it reminded me of teaching Sophie to fix her bicycle chain all those years before. Priya was sharp, patient, and she listened to an old mechanic ramble about torque patterns and vibration signatures for 2 hours without once looking at her phone. That's rare in anybody anybody at any age. It took us 3 years. 3 years of failed prototypes, of nights when the whole thing seemed impossible, of Linda bringing coffee into the garage turned office at midnight without saying a word, just setting the cup down and squeezing my shoulder before she went back to bed. 3 years of small independent shops trying our early software for free and giving us brutal, honest feedback, the same kind of honesty I used to give my own customers. By the time I was 57, Miller Diagnostics had 12 employees and a piece of software that could tell a mechanic within minutes what would have taken a skilled hand hours to diagnose the old-fashioned way without replacing that hand, without replacing that instinct, just giving it better information to work with. That was always the principle. Never replace the person, just give them better tools. By the time I was 62, we had contracts with independent repair shops in 11 states. By 65, we were the largest automotive diagnostics platform in the country. And I still, to this day, could not tell you exactly when it happened because I was never watching the number. I was watching the work. Linda didn't live to see all of it. She passed 5 years before Sophie walked through our doors. Pneumonia that turned into something worse, quick, mercifully quick, though nothing about losing her felt merciful to me. Her last clear words to me in the hospital were, "You built something real, Jack. Don't you dare let anybody tell you it wasn't." I think about that more than almost anything else she ever said to me. I never remarried, never really tried to. Some things you build once in a lifetime and you don't go looking to build them twice. I want to talk about Sophie now because while all of this was happening on my end of things, she was growing up on the other side of a wall her parents built brick by brick without her ever knowing they were building it. Ethan and Vanessa told her over the years a version of the story that was easier for them to live inside of. Grandpa had a stroke and it changed him. Grandpa decided the shop was too much work and retired quietly. Grandpa drifted away from the family afterward, got distant, got strange, stopped calling as often. They never said I abandoned them outright, not in so many words. They just built the story out of small omissions, the kind that add up over 18 years into something that looks a lot like truth if you never examine it too closely. I want to be honest about my part in this too because I wasn't blameless in the silence. After what happened, I pulled back from the family. I sent birthday cards. I called on holidays. But I never showed up at their house uninvited, never pushed my way into Sophie's life the way I could have. Part of that was self-protection. I didn't trust myself not to say something I couldn't take back in front of a child. And part of it, if I'm honest with myself, the way Linda always pushed me to be, was pride. I didn't want to beg my way back into a family that had thrown away everything I'd spent my life building without so much as a phone call. So Sophie grew up believing a soft, sad, forgivable version of a story that was actually much harder and much less forgivable than what she'd been told. She loved her grandfather in the abstract. The memory of the man who let her get grease on her hands and taught her to fix a bicycle chain, while believing that same man had eventually chosen to disappear from her life for reasons she never quite understood. She grew into a remarkable young woman despite all of that, or maybe in some strange way because of it. She studied mechanical engineering. She was sharp with her hands the way I'd always been, sharp with numbers the way Ethan claimed to be but never really was. She had Linda's way of making people feel important when she talked to them, and she had, though she didn't know where it came from, my exact stubborn insistence that you don't fix what you don't understand. In her final year of college, her program required an internship at a company in her field. She and her classmates were assigned to research and apply to several companies, and her professor, a woman named Dr. Alvarez, who I never met but whom I have thought about with real gratitude more times than I can count, put a particular company at the top of the recommended list for students interested in automotive systems. Miller Automotive Technologies. Sophie has told me since, more than once, laughing a little at herself each time, that she genuinely thought it was a coincidence. Miller is not an uncommon name. She filled out the application almost as a formality, thinking it was a long shot, regardless, one of 6 companies on her list. That night, out of nothing more than idle curiosity, she looked up the company founder online. She has told me what that moment felt like, and I have turned it over in my mind so many times since, trying to imagine it from her side. A photograph loaded on her laptop screen. An older man, gray-haired, standing in front of a modest headquarters building with his arms crossed and a small, tired smile. The kind of smile a man wears when a photographer has asked him to smile for the third time and he's starting to lose patience with it. She has told me she sat there for almost 10 full minutes without moving. She didn't tell her parents, not then, and not for a long while after. Something in her, some instinct she couldn't yet name, told her to keep this discovery close and quiet, the same instinct maybe that made her grandfather kneel silently in a patch of weeds 18 years earlier instead of screaming at the sky. She applied. She interviewed with our human resources director, a good woman named Deborah, who had no idea at the time what name she was reading off that application because Sophie's last name was common enough not to raise any flags on its own, and I'd never once mentioned having a granddaughter in the building, because I genuinely never expected her to walk through those doors. Sophie was accepted into our internship program on her own merit. I want to be completely clear about that because it matters enormously to what came after. Deborah selected her out of nearly 200 applicants based on her transcripts, her project portfolio, and 2 rounds of technical interviews that had nothing whatsoever to do with me. She earned her way into that building the same way I built the company that put it there. Nobody handed her anything. Not yet. Orientation day for new interns fell on the same morning. I traditionally gave a welcome talk to incoming classes, something I'd done every single intern cycle for almost a decade, standing in the same auditorium, telling the same story about a boy who learned to fix engines from his father's old toolbox, because I believed, the way Linda always believed, that people work harder for something when they understand the human story underneath it. I didn't know Sophie would be in that room. I want you to understand that. I walked in that morning with my notes, same as always, ready to tell 40 new interns about honest work and second chances, having absolutely no idea that my own granddaughter was sitting in the third row watching me walk toward the podium with an expression on her face that Deborah later told me looked like someone watching a ghost stand up and start talking. I got about 2 sentences into my usual opening before I saw her. I want to tell you exactly what that moment felt like because I've had a lot of time to think about how to say it. It felt like the floor tilted very slightly under my feet, the way it used to right after the stroke when my balance wasn't entirely my own yet. I saw her face, Linda's eyes, unmistakably set into a face that had grown up in the years I hadn't been allowed to watch it grow. And for one full breath, I couldn't remember a single word of the speech I had given probably 200 times before. I finished the talk. I don't fully remember how. Something in me, some old instinct built over 45 years of showing up to work, no matter what was happening in my chest that day, carried me through to the end. Then I asked everyone else to step out, and I asked Sophie to stay. The room emptied slowly, the way rooms do when everyone senses something is happening that isn't quite their business. Deborah lingered by the door for a moment, looking between the two of us with a question on her face she didn't quite know how to ask, and I gave her a small nod that told her it was all right, and she left too. 2 chairs remained in that empty auditorium, Sophie and me, 40 feet of open floor between us, and 18 years of silence, sitting right there in the middle of it. "You look like your grandmother," I said. It was the only thing I could think to say that felt true enough to start with. Sophie didn't move for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was smaller than I expected from a young woman who, I'd later learn, could hold a room of engineers steady during a technical crisis without breaking a sweat. "They told me you retired," she said. "After your stroke, they said you just wanted a slower life." I sat down in the chair nearest me, my legs suddenly feeling every one of my 69 years. "Sophie," I said, "can I tell you what actually happened? Not because I need you to be angry at anybody. I don't have use for anger anymore, not after this many years. But I think you deserve the truth, whatever you decide to do with it." She sat down across from me. She didn't say yes, exactly. She just waited, the way I taught her to wait when she was 7 years old handing me tools before I asked for them, because she'd learned to watch closely enough to know what came next. So I told her about the stroke, about waking up in that hospital bed, unable to say the word wrench. I told her about asking her father to keep the lights on. I told her about coming home to an empty building with the sign torn down and the concrete scrubbed clean. I told her about kneeling in the weeds beside my own toolbox, about the missing spark plug box, about her grandmother's wedding ring that wasn't where it was supposed to be. I did not tell her to hate her father. I want that understood clearly. I have never, not once in 18 years, asked anyone to hate Ethan on my behalf. I only told her what happened in plain, unembellished language, the same way I used to tell a customer exactly what was wrong with their car and let them decide what to do about it. Sophie sat very still through most of it. Somewhere in the middle, her hands started shaking slightly, and she pressed them flat against her knees to stop them. A gesture I recognized because I'd seen Linda do the exact same thing at moments when she was holding something enormous together by sheer will. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she asked the only question that seemed to matter to her in that moment. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because you were 7 years old when it happened," I said. "And by the time you were old enough to hear it, I didn't know how to walk into your life and say those words without it looking like I was trying to steal you away from your own parents. I decided it wasn't my place to make that choice for you. I figured if the truth ever found you on its own, you'd know I never lied to you. I never told you a single untrue thing in your whole life, Sophie. I just went quiet. And I understand now that quiet can look a lot like abandonment if nobody explains it." She left that afternoon without telling me what she intended to do with what I'd said. I didn't ask her to promise anything. I've learned over the years that you cannot fix a person the way you fix an engine. You cannot simply diagnose the problem and expect them to run the way they used to the moment you tighten the right bolt. People need time to test the truth against everything they thought they already knew. She went home that night and confronted her father. I wasn't there for that conversation, obviously, and I want to be careful not to pretend I know exactly how it unfolded, because Sophie only ever gave me the broad strokes of it, not wanting, I think, to relive it more than she had to. But I know this much because she told me directly, and because of what happened after. Ethan denied it at first, told her I was manipulating her, that I was bitter, and had twisted the story to make myself look like the victim. Sophie has told me that this was the moment something in her went cold and very calm, a stillness she recognized oddly as the same stillness she used to feel over a car engine when a problem finally made sense. She had, in the days before that confrontation, quietly done her own research. She'd pulled old newspaper articles from the local paper's digital archive, a small piece from 18 years earlier about the sudden closure of Miller Auto Repair, quoting confused longtime customers wondering what had happened to old Jack. She'd found the hospital admission date for my stroke and matched it almost exactly against the county business registration filing that showed the property being sold for salvage value less than 6 weeks later. While I was still in a rehabilitation facility 3 counties away, unable to hold a pen steady enough to sign my own name, let alone stop a sale I never knew was happening, she laid all of it on the kitchen table in front of her father. Newspaper clippings, hospital records, the registration filing with his signature on it, dated while I was still learning to walk in a straight line down a hospital corridor. She didn't say a word. She has told me that the silence in that kitchen after she set the last paper down was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. I won't pretend the family didn't come apart, at least for a while, after that. Ethan and Vanessa's marriage had been under strain for years by that point. I'd heard, through the thin channels of information that still reached me, that Ethan's various business ventures over the years had never quite delivered what he promised they would. A real estate scheme that collapsed, a franchise investment that lost money for 3 straight years before he finally cut his losses. He'd spent nearly 2 decades chasing the version of success he thought I was too small-minded to understand, and none of it had ever added up to the steady, patient thing I'd built with dirty hands and an honest reputation. About 8 months after Sophie confronted him, Ethan's last significant venture, a chain of quick-service auto detailing shops he'd sunk most of what remained of their savings into, finally failed completely. Not because anyone sabotaged him, not because the world was unfair to him, because, as one of his own former business partners told Sophie later, Ethan had never learned the thing his father tried to teach him without ever quite saying it out loud, that you cannot build something lasting on shortcuts, no matter how confidently you talk about it in a boardroom. He called me in the fall. It was the first time we'd spoken directly in almost 2 years. His voice on the phone was different than I remembered. Smaller, worn down at the edges. He asked if we could meet. I said yes, because whatever else was true, he was still my son, and some doors you don't close permanently just because they were opened badly the first time. We met at a diner on the edge of town, not the shop, not my house. Neutral ground, his suggestion, and I understood why. He looked older than his 42 years that day. He didn't come in wearing the confident suit I remembered from years before. He looked like a man who had run out of the one currency he'd always relied on, which was his own certainty. He didn't ask for money right away, though we both knew that's eventually where the conversation was headed. He talked instead about Sophie, about how she wasn't speaking to him much these days, about how the divorce from Vanessa had gone through that summer. He talked in circles for a while, the way people do when they're working up to something they're ashamed of. Finally, he looked at me across that table and he said, "Dad, I need help. I know I don't have any right to ask you for it, but I don't know where else to go." I sat with that for a long moment. I thought about the toolbox in the weeds. I thought about Linda's ring missing from a drawer where it had lived through 30 anniversaries. I thought about 3 months of relearning how to hold a coffee cup while my son sold everything I'd built to a scrap dealer for whatever quick cash it could bring him. "Ethan," I said, "and I want you to understand, I said this quietly the same way I've said everything true in my life. You sold the only thing I ever asked you to protect. For a long time, I was angry about that. I'm not angry anymore. Anger's heavy, and I got tired of carrying it somewhere around year 6. But I'm not going to hand you the keys to a life you helped destroy the last time I trusted you with something that mattered. I built this company after you took everything else from me. I'm not going to let you borrow it now just because the shortcuts finally ran out." He didn't argue with me. I think somewhere underneath everything, he knew I was right in the way people sometimes know a truth long before they're ready to admit they know it. "What do I do?" he asked, and for the first time since he was a small boy, he sounded genuinely lost rather than certain of an answer I was too slow to understand. "I don't know," I told him honestly, "but I'll tell you what I did 18 years ago when I had nothing left either. I started over, small, honest, one customer at a time. I'm not saying it's fast, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's the only way I know that actually holds up. I didn't give him money that day. I want to be honest about that because some viewers watching this might expect a different ending, one where the father forgives everything and writes a check and the son gets a second chance handed to him the same way the first chance was handed to him and squandered. That's not what happened, and I don't think it should have happened. And I think if Linda were alive, she would have told me the same thing. What I did instead was offer him something smaller and I think more useful. I told him Frank still needed help training new mechanics at the original diagnostic service center we still operated. Hands-on work, entry level, nothing that traded on the Miller name for anything except honest labor. I told him if he wanted it, it was his, same as it would be for anyone else who walked in off the street looking for work. No guarantees beyond that, no shortcuts. He took 2 weeks to decide. When he finally called Frank, he showed up on his first day looking like a man who had genuinely never held a wrench with intention in his life, which in fairness he hadn't. Frank told me later that Ethan was terrible at it for the first month, clumsy, impatient, the kind of frustration that comes from a person discovering later in life than most that competence has to be earned slowly and there's no MBA that shortcuts your way past that particular truth. He's still there as of the time I'm telling you this. He's not brilliant at it, but Frank says he's gotten better. Says he shows up on time now, which Frank tells me with a dry kind of humor is more than he can say for some of the 22-year-olds he's trained over the years. I don't know what Ethan and I are to each other now. Exactly. We're not what we once were, and we're not strangers either. We're two men who are slowly, cautiously learning to trust each other again in small, unremarkable increments. The way trust actually gets rebuilt, which is nothing at all like the movies make it look. Sophie, though, Sophie is the part of the story I think about with the least amount of complication in my chest. The part that feels, even after everything, entirely and simply good. She finished her internship with us that year, and she finished it the way she started it, earning every single evaluation on her own merit, working under supervisors who had no particular reason to go easy on her, and if anything held her to a slightly higher standard once they learned whose granddaughter she was, because nobody in that building wanted to be accused of playing favorites with the founder's family. She didn't need the favor. That's the part I'm proudest of. When her internship ended and a permanent position opened up in our research and development division, she applied through the same process as every other candidate, and she was hired by a hiring committee that included exactly 0 input from me, because I made sure of that specifically, the same way Linda used to make sure every customer got the same honest quote, whether they were a stranger or the mayor's wife. 2 years after that, we launched a new initiative, a program designed to bring young engineers straight from apprenticeship programs and trade schools into real product development roles, instead of the traditional pipeline that only ever seemed to notice graduates of expensive 4-year universities. It was an idea Sophie brought to me herself, unprompted, sitting in my office one afternoon with a proposal she'd built entirely on her own time. "Grandpa," she said, sliding the folder across my desk, "you always told me you don't fix what you don't understand. I think this company understands cars better than almost anybody in the country. I don't think it understands people who learn with their hands instead of a diploma. I want to fix that." I read through her proposal twice before I said anything, mostly because I didn't trust my own voice in that moment. It was, without a single exaggeration, one of the best pieces of thinking anyone in that company had brought me in years, family or otherwise. I made her head of the program, head of apprentice innovation, we called it officially. Though most people around the building just call it Sophie's program to this day. She built it from 4 participants in the first year to over 200 across 11 states within 3 years, young men and women learning trades the same way I learned mine, hands in the engine, earning their instincts one honest repair at a time, except now they had better tools than I ever did. Tools that a stubborn old mechanic and a patient engineer had built together in a leaking warehouse 2 decades earlier. On the day we officially announced the program to the company, I gave her something I'd been holding on to for a very long time. I'd found my old toolbox again years earlier. Not long after the diagnostics business started to take off, I tracked it down through a salvage yard 2 towns over, purely out of some sentimental stubbornness I couldn't quite explain even to myself at the time. It had been sitting in a corner of that salvage yard for years, rusted, half its drawers stuck shut, looking exactly as forgotten as I'd felt the day I found it dumped in the weeds behind my old shop. I paid the owner more than it was worth and brought it home, and I spent the better part of a winter restoring it in my garage, sanding, refinishing, replacing hardware, the same patient work I used to put into a customer's engine. When I finally pried open the bottom drawer, the one that had been stuck solid for who knows how many years, I found a small metal spark plug box wedged behind a warped panel, the kind of hiding spot that could only have happened if the box had been shoved aside carelessly during whatever hurried sale had emptied that shop, missed entirely by whoever was hauling everything out for scrap. Linda's ring was inside it. I sat on the floor of my garage for a long time that afternoon, holding a small gold ring that had outlasted a stroke, a betrayal, 18 years, and a scrapyard. And I made a decision right there that I wasn't going to wear it, and I wasn't going to sell it, and I wasn't going to simply keep it in a drawer somewhere waiting for nothing. I decided I was going to give it someday to whoever in this family proved they understood what Linda always understood, that you don't fix people by handing them things. You fix them by giving them the tools and trusting them to do the work themselves. On the day we launched Sophie's program, I brought the toolbox into the auditorium. The same auditorium, as it happens, where she'd first watched me walk toward a podium 2 years before, not knowing I was her grandfather. I set it on the table in front of her, in front of a room full of employees who had no idea what they were about to witness. This belonged to my father, I told her in front of everyone, and then it belonged to me, and I lost it once, a long time ago, in a way I never fully explained to most people in this room. I got it back, and I've decided it's time it belonged to somebody else. I opened the bottom drawer for her. Sophie's hands went still over the small gold ring the way mine had, years earlier on the floor of that garage. I don't think she understood right away exactly what she was looking at. When I explained it, quietly, just for her, though half the room by then had gone silent enough to hear a pin drop, I watched her eyes fill in a way I hadn't seen since she was small enough to sit on an overturned bucket, handing me tools before I even asked for them. "Your grandmother always believed good hands could fix anything," I told her. "Cars, people, whole families, given enough time and enough patience." Turns out she was right about that, same as she was right about most things. I just needed 18 years and a granddaughter with your name on an application to finally prove it. I don't tell you this story because I want you to hate my son. I've had 18 years to sit with what he did. And somewhere around year 6, I set the anger down, not because he earned forgiveness in some grand dramatic gesture, but because I got tired of carrying something that heavy for that long. Carrying it wasn't punishing him, it was only punishing me. I tell you this story because I think a lot of people watching this have somebody in their life who disappointed them in a way that felt unforgivable at the time. And I think a lot of people are carrying tools they don't even remember they're still holding. Old grudges, old grief, old versions of the truth that got told told to them by somebody who had their own reasons for shading it a certain way. I built a company out of grease-stained instinct and 45 years of honest work, and none of that, not $1 of it, mattered as much to me in the end as the moment I watched my granddaughter hold her grandmother's ring in a room full of strangers and finally understand where she came from. If you were in my place, if your own son had done what mine did and showed up years later, worn down and asking for help, could you have said what I said to him that day in the diner? Could you have offered him the smaller, harder path instead of the easy forgiveness and meant it with love either way? I'd like to know what you would have done differently. Tell me in the comments, because I think the honest answer is different for every one of us. And I don't believe there's only one right way to carry a story like this. And if stories like this one mean something to you, stories about family, about the kind of honor that gets earned in small, quiet increments instead of handed down for free, about second chances that come with real conditions attached, then I hope you'll stay with us here at Honor Returned. There are more stories like mine waiting to be told. Because dignity, in my experience, always finds its way home. It just doesn't always come back the way you expect it to.